Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight. It's great fun for me to sort of have Ed Glaeser here. This is an event that's sponsored. I should get all our sponsors out by the Lenfest grant at SIPA, the Economics Department, the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate, and the Center for Urban Research and Politics. And we're especially lucky because Ed is sort of one of the leading urban economists in the country. In fact, I have a cite here. I said, I think Ed is probably the most exciting urban researcher in a half century, if not longer, from a New York Times article that was devoted completely to Ed. Before talking more about Ed, I'll just say that's why we're here. We're also very lucky to have two very distinguished panelists who will also be commenting on Ed's work. The first is Esther Fuchs, who's very well known in New York as one of the leading advisors to Michael Bloomberg, who's worked at a number of important New York City projects, including she's an advisor on the governance and strategic planning at New York City. She worked on out-of-school time program, and she worked on the Integrated Human Services Project and the 2005 New York City Charter Revision Commission. Chris Mayer is actually the Paul Milstein Professor of Real Estate and Director of the Paul Milstein Center at Columbia, and has done a lot of important work on both real estate pricing and is now currently working on the subprime mortgage market. They're going to comment on the paper that we're going to speak about today, presented by Ed Glaeser. And it's actually quite fitting that we're doing this here in this wonderful location above New York that he's going to talk about. And the question we're going to ask as we look up north and south, we see this sort of enormous vista of concrete buildings of various heights. And Ed is going to sort of help us understand why this exists, why it will be here, and what it's going to look like over the next century or so. He has an extremely, like many distinguished professors, his CV is sort of a long booklet, so I won't be able to read all of it. But he's currently the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He's also the director of the Tombin Center for State and Local Government at John F. Kennedy School, the director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and he's also the editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics, as many of us in the Economics Department are very aware of. So what I would like to do is before spending any more time introducing him, I would let him talk about urban Colossus, why New York is America's largest city. Over to you, Ed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much for coming. I grew up in New York, and I always love being here, and I'm particularly thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about New York here. Let me start with what I think is the central paradox of this talk, which is in a world in which transportation and communication costs appear to have vanished away to nothingness, in a world in which we are told that, the distance is dead, the world is flat, that somehow or other cities are more vital than ever. That cities, which are, after all, proximity, their closeness, their density, they're the absence of physical space between people and firms, they exist to connect people. That those cities, despite all these changes in information technology, despite all the incredible reduction in transportation costs, those cities are doing remarkably well. We see this in terms of the high wages that are being paid in places like Manhattan or Boston. We see this in the remarkable rise in housing prices. And we see this even, although to a much lesser degree, in rising population levels in at least some of these areas. This is the relationship across metropolitan areas between density and income across American metropolitan areas. Denser places are richer areas. Without attempting to, claim any causality on that, it is certainly true that there's a very strong link between density and per capita income across space. And of course, that's true across the world as well, that urbanization and income tend to go together. And that connection has in no sense abated over time. There's no sense in which cities are becoming less important to the development process. In fact, if you just think about the Tom Friedman book on Bangalore, think about how much of the development is there in the city. Right? We're not talking about the plains outside of Hyderabad. We're talking about dense urban areas as being the gateways between the developed world and the developing world, just as they were in New York 4 centuries ago. The hypothesis that's sort of running through this talk is that, in fact, the impact oddly, paradoxically, the impact of declining transportation and communication costs has been to make at least certain types of proximity more valuable. That in fact the same depth of distance, the same decline in transportation costs that made goods-producing cities like Detroit so troubled, so difficult, and indeed made New York in the 1970s seem like a city that was a dinosaur, that those changes in technology, those declining transportation and communication costs, have actually played a major role in New York's revitalization. And the key to this hypothesis, the argument, is that in fact what technology has done, what globalization has done, is that it's increased the returns to being smart, right? And we see this in a wide degree of context, right? We've had 15 years of literature showing the remarkable rise in the returns to skill in the US and many other economies. But in fact, just as you get smart by being around smart people in schools, you get smart by being around smart people in cities, right? That fundamentally what Wall Street is about ideas and about connection, and young people come to it to learn in it. And just as we've increased the returns to getting a college degree, we've increased the returns to being around smart people in clusters like the financial services industry in New York. So the sort of central theme here is that cities aren't going away. They aren't being hurt by the death of distance. They have never been hurt over a long period of time by globalization. The rise of cities is intimately related to the rise of trade and the connection of the world. And indeed, cities are likely to be a dynamic, important part of human society for decades, centuries to come. And that, in fact, we should understand them. We should take care of them. We should think about what they are and what they mean. In discussing New York, let me start a millennium ago. The early commercial cities of Europe, in fact, almost all commercial cities prior to, say, 1850, prior to 1900, were either clothing cities or food cities. These were the two great necessities of humankind. They were the two great objects that were being traded. And cities, of course, always need an object to trade, right? Cities are intrinsically lacking in agricultural products, and they need to figure out some way to justify their existence, some way to earn enough returns so that their residents can survive. Since clothing and food are the big commodities that human beings consume, clothing and food have fundamentally been what cities are about. And until about 1800, clothing was much more important than food, primarily because it's easier to transport, right? It usually involves a little bit more value added by urban workers. And while basic food commodities tend not to be all that durable, and certainly they have less value per ton, clothing, in fact, was a high value item throughout most of the world, throughout most of world history. So if we go back to the dawn of the modern urban age about 1,000 years ago, the great cities that grew up in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages were clothing cities. It's true of Florence, it's true of Bruges, it's even true to a lesser degree of London, which is also something of a political city, which is a different animal altogether. These cities formed for very understandable economic reasons, right? They were clusters built around expertise in making wool. The textile towns of Flanders had a tradition that goes back to the Roman era of making woolen cloth. They took advantage of their relatively mediocre land to grow sheep on it, and that wool was, say, used by Charlemagne to actually send an expensive Frisian garment to his eastern equivalent, Caliph El-Rashid, I think. The cities grew up around wool, and they grew up around trade. And the same sort of miraculous things that we tend to see in cities today, where new innovations occur, where people learn from one another, were going on there. Guilds existed to regularize the trade in ideas, to regularize the exchange of knowledge from older workers to younger workers. And new inventions were, of course, common. Cities were the entryways for things like the spinning wheel or the horizontal loom. Right? Major innovations in their time which increased the productivity of the wool trade. Of course, while cities formed for these sort of very prosaic clothing-related reasons, they also did sort of these amazing things on the side. Let me switch to one of them. This is one of the oldest oil paintings in existence. It's by Jan van Eyck. It of course, is an interior of Bruges, right? The greatest, at least in some ways, of all of the textile towns of the Low Countries. It's a remarkable painting in lots of ways. Obviously, it's incredibly beautiful. It's rife with symbolism. But it also looks incredibly modern in some ways. I'm told it is actually used or at least it was used in the introduction to Desperate Housewives. And it actually has played a role in recent presidential elections. Apparently, some people think the husband looks like Vladimir Putin. But it's as opposed to, say, the religious art of Masaccio, which very much looks medieval. It looks backwards towards a religious past. This is very much of a commercial age, right? These two people could be living on Park Avenue in their, maybe their clothes are a little bit funny, but this is a very modern merchant. The man is Arnolfini. He's an Italian. He has connections with. He's sort of a prototype of a Robert Rubin. He's a guy who moves back and forth between his trade, of course, in wool, and his connections with with various Burgundian courts. This painting is also urban, not just because it depicts such an urban scene, but because it came out of a cluster of innovativeness in urban areas. The sort of revolution in painting in the 15th century, both in Flanders and in Italy, is sort of one of the great examples of how smart people in cities invent by riffing off each other, right? The sort of rise of painting in Renaissance Florence, another wool town, of course, starts with an idea that Brunelleschi has about using linear perspective, that goes to Donatello, who puts in low relief sculpture, that goes to Masaccio, who puts it on the walls of the Brancacci Chapel, that go to his student Filippo Lippi. It's a chain of ideas, which is really what cities do well. Right? As they connect people, they enable one idea to work on the other. The same chain of ideas is going on in the relationship between Hubert and Jan van Eyck and their student Petrus Christus, or between Campen and van der Weyden and Memling. There's a similar chain where oil painting, where this skill is moved down. And it's these chains of inventiveness which were such an amazing byproduct of the wool-producing towns that really, to a certain extent, have given us our modern world. The chains of invention are really easy to see in painting, but there are also similarly amazing things that occur in literature, in religion, in music. The three most important religious figures in Europe in 1524 were surely Martin Luther, Pope Adrian VI, and Erasmus. All three of them were trained by a now fairly obscure order called the Brethren of the Common Life. The Brethren were founded by a native of Deventer, another low-country wool town in the 14th century. It was an order that basically functioned like a modern corporation in lots of ways. It had extensive book production facilities, and as a byproduct, it invented the modern secondary school. Those secondary schools, which did much as today, charged very large fees to wealthy merchants' children like Martin Luther to educate the children of poor people like Erasmus and Adrian VI. And that sort of spread of education was very much sort of part of what happened in these cities. Education, of course, and urban connections have a lot in common. Finally, of course, these cities very much gave us the rise of democracy. We're very, the urban role in democratic revolution is very easy to understand in America. After all, it was the urban connections between Sam Adams and John Hancock that connected his ability to raise a crowd through copious serving of alcohol with John Hancock's desire for a crowd that would give trouble to the English. We very much wanted to change their commercial policy. That process has a millennium behind it. Right? There's a statue in the city center of Bruges of a butcher and a weaver, appropriately enough for food and clothing cities, named Bridel and de Koninck. Right? These two were they were classic urban craftsmen, and they staged a massive revolution against their French overlords in the beginning of the 14th century. More successfully in the 16th century, right? It was the urban craftsmen rising against Philip II that gave us the first sustained republic in modern Europe. That republic, of course, gave us New York. Right? So in fact, it's the intellectual grandchildren of de Koninck and Bridel. It's Oldenbarnevelt. It's William of Orange who actually created the Dutch Republic, a republic very much devoted to urban things. And this is, of course, where this city comes from, right? We were a far-flung and not particularly important colony of this amazing trade network put together by this initially, at least, wool trading area. New York, of course, starts as a company town, not as a religious community, which creates pluses and minuses. The city was remarkably open, as it still is today. It was remarkably good at welcoming people of talent. Obviously, we all know the story of Stuyvesant being told to go to heck by his bosses back in Amsterdam when he tried to exclude Jews from the colony. Of course, the lack of religious fervor made it harder to provide public goods in New York during this time period. The Bostonians, with their extremely strong religious views, were a bit better on that. And the initial economy of New York revolves around furs. right? There's a clear product that Europe wants. Again, by the way, it's an object of clothing. And the furs are being, caught here and moved out. There is, in fact, even at the beginning, a certain amount of manufacturing of wampum and some degree of manufacturing for ships. So rope walks, for example, as late as 1810 were a major industry in the city. This is from Burroughs and Wallace, who, of course, have a wonderful history of New York. However, the furs ran out. The furs were farmed. The furs weren't enough to maintain a large city. And like Boston, New York has this basic problem that its hinterland does not produce a commodity that's valuable enough to ship over the Atlantic back to the old world, right? I mean, our climate here is relatively close to the climate of the old world, so you can't make all that good stuff like sugar and tobacco that were the sort of centrally valued commodities because they couldn't be grown well back in England. So New York, like Boston, had to figure out a different way to survive throughout most of the colonial period. And this is basically how the core triangle trade came into existence, which, certainly there was slavery going on, but the core triangle trade was actually not that. It was the trade of basic commodities from New York and from Massachusetts down to the cities, down to the colonies that actually had valuable export items. This trade was actually pioneered by Boston, which was in a similar situation of having not the foggiest, idea of what to export, given that they have no natural products there other than cranberries that are actually of any value. So they ended up shipping some combination of fish and meat and wood products down to the cash-producing colonies of the South, which, of course, were much richer during this time period. So New York specializes in wheat. During this epoch, it's one of the first major food cities because it's basically about moving food from New York down to feed those colonies in the South where the land is too valuable to spend producing basic food. The growth during much of the colonial era was relatively modest. 300 people in 1630, 3,000 in 1680. By the time of the Revolution, there's somewhere around 15,000 people in the city. It's a smaller town than Boston throughout most of the colonial era, and a significantly smaller town than Pennsylvania, in part because the New York hinterland wasn't actually safe enough to really farm until the 7 Years' War. The explosive decades in New York's growth were between 1790 and 1860. So this is a period in which New York's population grows from 33,000 to 813,000 people. It's really an incredible explosion. The annual rate of population increase rose from about 1.8% during the 18th century to 4.7%. And while in 1790 New York was 17% bigger than Philadelphia, by 1850 New York was 200% bigger than Philadelphia. New York had become America's urban colossus. This is just in absolute numbers, the growth of New York's population. And, if you look at this, it sort of looks like everything's going on in later periods. If you look at but that actually misses what's really going on. If you look at New York as a share of U.S. population, New York is rising very steadily throughout the 19th century to its peak of about 6% of the country's population 100 years ago. And this, of course, is the growth rates of New York by decade. So notice that the highest growth rates were in the first half of the 19th century. The only outlier being 1900, which is the decade of consolidation of 5 boroughs. So that's something of a misleading figure. And another thing to notice about this is that there's nothing unusual about the pre- or post-Erie Canal period. The Erie Canal was certainly one part of the transportation network that made New York grow, but it wasn't in any sense a watershed that changed the city to a huge degree. Those changes were going on before the canal. And that's, they're averaging about 50% a decade during this earlier time period. The city is really growing to an extraordinary degree. Two things are going on during this period. The first of which is that New York is becoming overwhelmingly America's dominant port. The second of which is that industry is growing up around that port. Okay, why does New York become America's dominant port between 1820 and 1860? In 1820, New York is a bigger port than Boston. It has a slight comparative advantage, but New York's exports were $13 million. Boston's exports were $12 million. It was close. By 1860, New York's exports were $145 million and Boston's were $17 million. 40 years later, it had completely blown away the competition, with perhaps the sole exception of New Orleans, which was really just exporting cotton without doing much to it. This is the explosion of exports from principal ports. Notice everything looks more or less alike until you get somewhere around 1820, and then New York and New Orleans, to be fair, is also diverging. What's happening here is an initial comparative advantage is being made much more valuable through a number of technological changes. So New York starts with an initial advantage. It is the natural port for the east coast of America. It has a central geographic location, which makes it better than Boston or Savannah. It has the Hudson. It has a 315-mile river that cuts into the countryside as opposed to the short and shallow Charles. It has the Erie Canal that cuts through to the Great Lakes system. All of these things make it slightly better than other ports. It has less distance to the ocean from the harbor than, say, Philadelphia or Baltimore. There's less ice than in other harbors. Philadelphia, actually, as a river harbor, has more ice problems than New York does. And, of course, it's a very deep water harbor. Not relative to Boston, but certainly relative to Philadelphia. Okay, so these are all the natural advantages that New York happened. Why did this become more important? Okay, the big deal is that between 1790 and 1850, America switches from point-to-point shipping to hub-and-spoke shipping. This is a technological change. It's one that's both made by entrepreneurs and also made possible by increasing boat sizes. And we move from a system where small boats basically go back and forth between the major European ports and every port along the American East Coast. The difference is by 1820, you're moving to a system in which there are very large boats going back and forth between the English ports in New York, and then they're switching to smaller boats for the coastal traffic. What's going on here? Well, one part of the switch is the move to packet lines. Packet lines are an innovation created by a Quaker cotton dealer, Jeremiah Thompson, in 1817. They regularize the shipment. They make things much quicker, and you actually know when you're going to leave the port as the result of this. Some people claim that actually financial innovations were also needed to create the packet lines. The boats become much bigger. I have a fact here on the next. Where's the fact of the boat? In the early 1820s, packet ships were typically from 300 to 400 tons. By 1838, you're looking at 1,000-ton ships that are crossing the ocean. These ships are then, by 1854, you have almost 2,000-ton ships. Big ships require big harbors, and they're natural for moving in the same way their 747 crosses from London to New York and then puts people on smaller planes for moving on. They create this hub and spoke system. So you have this increasing specialization of this harbor. This becomes the big hub of this hub and spoke system. And this is really, this change in technology basically creates an increasing returns of superstars effect, where, if you will, where New York becomes dominant. New York becomes an industrial powerhouse based on industries around the port. Right? Everything that's going on with New York during this time period then comes out around the port. So by 1850, for example, New York has 43,000 people in manufacturing and only 11,000 in commerce. Manufacturing is totally dominating commerce by 1850, while in 1820 the numbers are much closer. Over the 19th century, there are three consistently dominant industries. Sugar refining, I was reminded of this just walking by Havemeyer Hall on the way here. Havemeyer is, of course, the great name of late 19th century sugar producing, which produces the most value in 1810 and 1860, and it's the second most value in 1900. The garment trade, which is New York's largest manufacturing industry by employment between 1860 and the 1970s, and printing and publishing, which was the third largest garment manufacturing industry in 1860, and it passes the garment trade to be the largest in the 1970s. What's going on with sugar refining? We have a very long history of sugar refining here, going back to 1730. FDR's family fortune starts in sugar refining with Isaac Roosevelt and his refining operation on Wall Street. It's really the byproduct of the hub and spoke system. Sugar is an important commodity. It's a very valuable commodity. But it actually also has difficulties in shipping, particularly when refined. So sugar undergoes two transformations in its travels from the plantation to your table. Right? It's first processed from sugar cane to raw sugar, and then it's refined. Everybody, everywhere, processes sugar cane into raw sugar at the point of initial production. Right? It's crazy not to, because sugar cane rots, and because you're carrying around a whole lot of excess water weight. The key question is where you're going to refine it. And there are at least 3 different models, one of which is to refine it at the point of production, the second of which is to refine it at some middle point, and the third of which is to refine it at the point of final consumption. The third model, for example, was the dominant European model during much of the 18th and early 19th century. The U.S. moved to this middle point, and there are really 2 reasons for this. Why wasn't sugar refined in the tropics? Why didn't you do it at the initial point? This is from one of the great sugar economists. Crystals of sugar coalesced during the humid conditions of a long sea voyage, and so any imported refined sugar would have had to be reworked if customers were to have received the top quality. The transportation costs were just too high. The stuff would essentially be unrefined by the time it got there. Why wasn't sugar refined at its final destination? This is an example of scale economies at work. Sugar refineries were the big factories of their time period. If you put the production at New York, where all the sugar was going through anywhere because it was the hub and spoke, you have this natural ability to exploit scale economies and ship the sugar out. So New York's manufacturing base is based very strongly, in sugar at least, on its location as a port. The garment trade is exactly the same story, right? What is Jeremiah Thompson shipping on all his packet lines? Cotton, right? The cotton is moving out of the U.S. A lot of it's going through New York, although a lot of it's also going through New Orleans. It's going to England, it's being turned into textiles in England, and then the textiles are being shipped back to New York. Okay? It is a very natural thing to then turn those textiles into garments in New York City, especially given the huge demand created by sailors, created by the working people in New York. So New York became a garment city because of the cotton trade that went through New York. Again, it came out of its port. And just as there were innovations in the wool production in Bruges 7 centuries ago, the concentration of garment production in New York created huge innovations throughout its time period, from the start of ready-to-wear, which is very much associated with the city. Elias Howe got the idea of his sewing machine actually from a shop window in Boston, a very classic example of urban connections leading towards innovation. Not in New York, but there, of course, have been vast numbers of innovations, from ones regarding technology to ones regarding the styles. Finally, printing and publishing. This is one of my favorite stories. I'm just going to read from Burroughs and Wallace. In early 19th century publishing, the big money came from pirated copies of English authors who didn't yet have to be paid royalties because the United States government refused as yet to recognize foreign copyrights. A huge advantage came from being the first printer. You could even, in some sense, by moving first, essentially reduce the returns to anyone competing from you, since you could already flood the market for it. During the 1820s, there were huge races between the Harper brothers and their Philadelphia competitors, Carey and Lee, to actually come out with the first copy of, say, the latest Sir Walter Scott novel. New York was the prime port. It got the books first. As a result, Harper published first. Right? So this was a huge part of New York's rise as publishing, as they were the ones who got the ideas first off the book. They got the novels first, and they were able to publish first. In the late 19th century, New York continues to rise around its port. Its manufacturing structure remains remarkably consistent over the 19th century. Those 3 industries end up being dominant. The big thing that changes in New York, the big thing that floods our population, of course, is immigration. Immigration is, again, part of the port. These are just the number of immigrants coming to New York by decade. The immigrants are coming to New York because it is a transport hub. It's one of the striking things about Boston, of course, is how Irish the city is. Boston is Irish in a degree to which New York is not, although more Irish immigrants came to New York than came to Boston in the 1840s. Irish is Boston in a way that New York is not, because the 1840s was the last epoch, the last period in which Boston could meaningfully compete with New York as a transport center. So if you were a starving Irish immigrant, it was fairly natural to come to Boston and to stay there, because it was mildly faster to get there and occasionally mildly cheaper. By 1880, Boston had a huge advantage for anyone who was crossing the Atlantic, and as a result, New York completely dominated the immigrant trade, the immigrant business. That's not the right word. Completely dominated immigration. Immigrants, of course, stayed in New York. That reflected partially the transportation costs of moving west. It reflected the enormous ability of cities to create gains from trade between people without capital, i.e. immigrants, and people with capital, who then employed them in industries like the garment trade. The garment trade was also a great industry for immigrants because it created lots of opportunities to move up the chain. There's lots of ability for people with small amounts of capital to become jobbers or small shop owners. It proved to be very conducive for immigrants. In some sense, the economic miracle is, despite these hundreds of thousands of people flowing in, that wages don't appear to have dropped more as a result of this in New York. New transportation technologies enabled the city to move out. It's in the 19th century that you get this first pattern of rich people living in faraway areas from the downtown and poor people living closer. If you go back to the late 18th century, you have the pattern that, say, you see in Paris today, where the rich people lived at the city center, say down near Bowling Green. The switch was very much associated with new technologies, like the omnibus and the subway, which were too expensive for poor people to use. So rich people used these technologies to move up. Poor people stayed downtown. That's the same pattern, of course, we saw in the 20th century with the rise of the automobile, where, in fact, proximity to public transportation is a big factor in explaining why relatively poor people tend to live in dense urban areas. Of course, the 20th century ended up being quite problematic for big cities like New York. Immigrant populations declined after the 1921 quota. The automobile made public transportation-oriented cities seem somewhat obsolete. The truck freed manufacturing from having to cluster around ports and rail yards. And you just had this sort of massive decline in the advantages that came from being around a port. Right? This is the real cost of moving a ton a mile by rail. It's declined by 90% over the 20th century. While it was incredibly valuable to be close to a port in the 19th century, in fact, it was more costly in 1816 to move goods 20 miles over land than it was to have them cross the Atlantic. Right? By 2000, the advantages of clustering near a port are almost zero. And the garment trade, which had such port-related advantages in the first part of the 20th century, essentially has no such advantages now. To the extent to which fashion exists in New York, it's coming from something else that I'm going to get to in a second. The problems that hit New York in the middle part of the 20th century were certainly not unique to the city. In fact, what is surprising is how well the city did despite those problems. All dense cities, this is the relationship across metropolitan areas between density in 1920 and subsequent population growth between 1920 and 1980. As you can tell, density is a very good explanatory variable in showing which cities did poorly. And of course, the best variable for explaining population growth across metropolitan areas over the last 100 years is January temperature. Right? As people no longer needed to cluster around productive advantages like the Great Lakes or coal mines, they could move to places that were pleasant, and they did. Right? So they chose to move away from cold areas to warm areas. New York, of course, was hit hard by this. This is the decline in manufacturing employment in New York from 1940 to 2000. That decline has not changed. The revitalization of New York has certainly not been built on anything faintly resembling manufacturing. The city is just not a natural place to put a mature industry that tends to be fairly space-intensive, that produces goods that are fairly easy to ship over space. There's no actual conceivable advantage why you would want to do that anymore in the dense island of Manhattan or in anywhere else. By all rights, New York should have been hit as hard as any place else. It's at least moderately cold and highly dense and particularly unfriendly to the car. Manufacturing led the city. It's not like we think New York government was so spectacular. But it did relatively well. These are the 10 largest cities in the U.S. in 1950 and how they did over the subsequent 50 years. 8 out of these 10 had population declines over these 50 years, and some of them had truly spectacular declines, right? I mean, St. Louis, 60% decline. Detroit, 52% decline, right? You want to see what this looks like? All you have to go to is the three upstate cities in New York of Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo to see sort of the tremendous decline that these older places once had. New York gained 1.5% of population over the last 50 years. It's sort of an absolutely amazing thing. It's, in fact, the only one of the 15 cities outside the Sun Belt with more population today than in 1930, and 15 largest cities. Even the bleak 1970s weren't as bad. Now, what's interesting, of course, about New York's revitalization is whereas throughout much of the 19th century, New York had a very balanced economy. Right? The garment trade was big, but it wasn't overwhelming. The revitalization of New York has been remarkably tied to a single narrow strip of industries. Right? Financial services are the economic engine of this city. Right, so the top 3-digit industry in finance has 28% of the city's payroll. The top 4 3-digit industries have 56% of New York's payroll. I mean, that's a remarkable degree of payroll concentration in a narrow degree of industries. The comparable number for Boston, say, is 37%. Finance, New York finance, of course, is a legacy of the port. It starts about ensuring people who are crossing the Atlantic. Early finance on Wall Street is about handling risk. Then there's a move into other stocks and bonds. Proximity begets innovation, as it does in the garment trade as well. New York's special access to England through the port also makes it a natural place for people like August Belmont to set up shop as being the representatives of the Rothschilds during this period. New York's density continues to make it a very special place for finance. There's no other industry where information yields profits more quickly than financial services. Knowledge moves more quickly over dense areas, and New York continues to be a place where you get the best information quickly. That's important both in sort of a day-to-day learning what's going on sense, but also the acquisition of human capital. Right? Cities are forges of skills, and the concentration of talent in Wall Street or in Midtown are places where young people can come and actually learn how to do their jobs. That's sort of one of the interesting facts about the urban wage premium, right, is that the 30% wage premium that you get from locating in a metropolitan area surrounding a big city does not come to migrants when they immediately come to the city. It comes only over time with faster wage growth in the urban area, which at least is suggestive of the idea that cities are about acquiring human capital. Another fact that goes along with that is the strong interaction between years of experience in the labor force and city residents in predicting wages. People who live more in cities tend to have higher wages than people who didn't. The actual chain of ideas, the actual innovation of finance looks remarkably similar to the chains of ideas like Botticelli to Donatello to Masaccio, right? There's sort of a chain of ideas that, academics can flatter ourselves as thinking of, as coming out of the academy about how to weigh risk and return that make their way to Wall Street in the 1960s with people actually borrowing ideas from the academy. Those skills are then used by other financiers like Michael Milken to then sell riskier assets because you're better able to evaluate risk. Milken is actually able to sell more risky assets. Those risky assets are then used by people like Henry Kravis, who then use them to restructure companies and to get value out of them. The ability to understand risk is also used by Lou Ranieri in creating the mortgage-backed security market to sell, to nationalize in some sense risk that had once been held by a smaller number of banks. And of course, even Michael Bloomberg is part of this, right? His sale of data is very much sort of part of the data, the risk processing revolution that needs to have people who actually know how to use data to think about risks. Hence, there's a demand for data, hence all those Bloomberg terminals. So it's a chain of ideas that's very similar to that works in 15th century Florence. But whereas that chain was an interesting byproduct of a city built on wool, this chain is the main business of the city. That sort of the creation of ideas in urban areas, which used to be sort of fun and interesting, is now the core of what cities do. And that's true not just in New York. It's true in all of the cities that have revitalized themselves. It's true in Bangalore. It's true in Milan. It's true in Minneapolis. It's true in Birmingham. All of the older cities that have reinvented themselves are fundamentally in the idea-producing business, not the goods-producing business. And they're exploiting the ability that cities have always had to connect people, to connect ideas with each other. They're exploiting those to become more productive. Just a few facts, okay? So one of the variables that is, suggestive of this story that I've told is the incredible connection between historical levels of human capital, which we take as being sort of a proxy for how idea-intensive the place is, and urban success over the last 20 or 30 years. So this is share of skilled workers in 1980 and rise in income. I think this is actually not controlling for individual income, but the same thing is true if you do control for individual income. That actually the value of being around skilled people in terms of a wage regression has gotten much stronger over the last 20 or 30 years. This is the relationship between skills and population growth in the Northeast and Midwest regions. It's about a 50% R-squared. It's certainly not perfect, but in fact, share of human capital in the city initially does a remarkably good job of predicting which cities have done well or poorly. You'll notice New York's population growth is basically right on the regression line. It's doing just as well as you would think that it would be doing, just as Altoona, Pennsylvania is doing just about as poorly as you'd expect it to be doing given its human capital base. This sort of thing also works if you use long historical lags of education like literacy at the turn of the century or occupational mixes in the 1880s. That's Simon Nardinelli's paper on this. This is the log wage residual. So this is residualizing wages with respect to all your individual attributes and then just regressing that on the average on the share of people in the city who have college degrees. Again, a very strong positive relationship. Being around skilled people is really incredibly valuable, and that's gotten much more valuable over time. One of the byproducts of this, which is somewhat interesting, is that skilled people have increasingly moved around other skilled people. This is the relationship between the change in the proportion of people in a metropolitan area with college degrees and the initial proportion of population in the area with college degrees. Places that started off with more skilled people have acquired more skilled people over time. This presumably occurs for many reasons, one of which is that skilled people increasingly innovate and are entrepreneurs in occupations that employ other skilled people. While Henry Ford innovated in a way that employed people with very, very minimal skills, Bill Gates innovates in a way that employs primarily other people with skills like his own. Okay. I'm going to take 5 minutes and just throw out a bunch of ideas very quickly about sort of understanding cities. I've tried to make a case that sort of cities, particularly idea-oriented cities, are remarkably important, remarkably vital. They created much of the world that we live in, and they have much that continues to make them very strong. 5 quick ideas. One of which is urban poverty is good. Okay? I don't mean, of course, that poverty is good or that inequality is good. I mean that specifically when you see poor people living in cities, do not think of that as an urban failure. Think of that as an urban success. Because, in fact, those people are not being made poor by urban areas. They are being attracted by urban areas, which provide both opportunity and things like public transportation, which are not available in suburban areas. It is not the poverty of New York's outer boroughs that is the problem. It is, in fact, the artificial equality of suburban areas that is, in fact, the more disturbing fact, because those areas actually are not ones in which poor people can actually find things that are, find a way to live that is attractive. Why are so many people still living in the Rust Belt? Second point, we still have a lot of cities that actually were goods-producing cities that have lost their ways. If they don't have particularly good skill bases, if they aren't close to other big centers of population, there's very little reason to think that they're going to be able to reinvent themselves. At least the past 50 years have shown very little reason that they're going to be able to do it. It is almost surely a mistake to think that the role of government policy is to try to revitalize them. It is almost surely, at least from an economic point of view, the right answer to think about what you can do that's best for the people in those areas. Now, sometimes investing in place is a good way to help people. I have a lot of trouble understanding how, $750 million on a light rail project in Buffalo did anything significant to help the poor people of Buffalo. Let me move on from here. This is just the point that, in fact, most of these areas are actually around because housing is durable and housing doesn't go away overnight. Point number 3, we've had a remarkable rise of places like New York, not just as places of production, but of places like consumption. We see this in the remarkable rise of reverse commuting, right? It would be unthinkable in the 1970s of my youth to have a whole lot of people living in downtown New York and then commuting out to the suburbs. Now it's a completely extraordinary event, and that's reflecting New York City as a consumer city, as a place of consumption as well as production. You see this even more strikingly, say, in San Francisco. Skip over that. This is the rise of one way to sort of think about this is again sort of throwing a relatively paradoxical thing, right? I mean, the spatial equilibrium approach to cities basically tells you that when real wages are high in an area, when prices relative to housing costs are particularly high, then something else is bad about the area. Right? If you think about the places that have extraordinarily high real wages holding individual skills constant, they're places that tend to be pretty unattractive. Right? They're places like Anchorage, Alaska, or Minneapolis, for that matter, or a bunch of places in Texas where you probably wouldn't want to go. Whereas the places that have incredibly low real wages are all in coastal California. Right? These are the places which apparently people seem to think is nice. Now, use that logic to think about what's happened in New York over the last 30 years. This is the relationship between city population and real wages in 1970. Big cities, high real wages. Okay? Housing prices aren't that high, and you're having to pay people a lot more to put up with the crime, the congestion, all the other urban problems. Flip forward today. New York happens to be a real outlier because we've gotten really high. This is the price index is really high during this time period. If you actually believe it, New York is the biggest consumer city in the country, which I don't. But the basic pattern that you've lost this sense in which cities have to pay people high real wages. This doesn't reflect, by the way, declining economic productivity. This is not declining nominal wages. It's that the prices have gotten so high for real estate relative to other things. Now, part of that's good, part of that's bad. Right? And the bad part is that in the early 1920s, New York City used to build 100,000 units a year. Right? New York City was not an unbuilt-up place in 1920, but still over those years, New York managed to build an amazing amount until the great and glorious Bloomberg administration. This is the trend of what you're seeing here very badly. This is the rising prices, and these are rising new production. What we've had in New York over the last 50 years, and indeed there's a turn-up. There really is, in fact, a turn-up over the last 7 years. So I really do, in fact, mean those words. In fact, there was a remarkable combination of New York building less and less and demand rising more and more. That cannot be about a decline in housing demand. That has to be something that's restricting supply. Now, in fact, there's no natural barrier to building up, and yet in New York, new buildings have been getting shorter and shorter. We went from having about 80% of new residential units in buildings with more than 20 stories in the 1970s to less than 40% in the 1990s. This reflects a variety of land use regulations that keep buildings short. If you're going to artificially make it difficult to build, you're going to mean that all the extra demand for New York is going to show up in higher prices, not higher quantities. And in this sense, New York is becoming a gated community. This is actually looking across metropolitan areas, showing basically the places that don't build. Places that are expensive don't build, and places that build a lot aren't expensive. That actually supply is the way you want to think about differences in prices across places to a certain extent. Let me move on what's good about sprawl. It is worthwhile remembering that New York does have competitors like Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, and Phoenix, which are the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country. We should not forget that they're actually growing because they're delivering something meaningful. Right? They're delivering a cheap way to live in a perfectly pleasant way for ordinary Americans. If cities actually want to compete with that, they're going to need to figure out how to do that as well. And just finally to end, I'll talk about this tomorrow. I've actually gone through sort of a carbon dioxide categorization of cities versus other areas. And the difference between the average emissions associated with a new house in New York City versus a suburb within our area is about $300 using at least one measure of the environmental cost of carbon dioxide emissions. The difference in terms of general development in New York versus Houston is about $400. New York isn't by any sense the greenest place in the country. San Diego actually gets that title, but it's in the top 10 in terms of places that are because, in fact, all of this high-density living, all of this use of public transportation is, in fact, relatively green. Unfortunately, we also need to heat a lot in colder places, and that works in the opposite directions. So let me just end by, just suggesting that, this does not mean that cities need artificial favoring, right? Places should compete with each other. Places should face a level playing field, just as firms should face a level playing field. But there are at least some ways right now in which cities don't face a level playing field. One of which is because cities are such good places for relatively poor people to come, cities have lots of poor people, and poor people are expensive to care for. Now, if we think, as I do, that America's poor are a national responsibility, not a local responsibility, then expecting cities to bear a huge degree of the burden of their poor people creates an artificial tax, if you will, on rich people who want to move to urban areas. That's sort of one non-level playing field aspect, which I think is worrying about what we're currently doing to cities. The second thing, of course, is the failure to correct for environmental externalities. That's a second sort of non-level playing field that artificially goes against cities. And the third thing I think is deeply troubling is the way that we've allowed property rights over new development to change. We've allowed institutions like the Landmarks Preservation Commission to have incredible power over new construction without any sort of real debate about that being appropriate. So let me just end there and hand it over to my discussants.
Well, thanks very much, Ed. That was wonderful. We have more ideas to discuss than we have time, so I guess we should get going. So what we'll do is we'll have Esther will speak first for 10 minutes or so, and then Chris will speak again for 10 minutes, and then we'll let Ed respond, and we'll have a little bit of banter for a few minutes, and then I'll open up to anybody who wants to ask a question. We'll have a question and answer period after that, and then everybody can do a little bit.
I mean, this is a very exciting talk and a very, I think, important talk that Professor Glaeser presented to us today. And, of course, for me, the most interesting points were saved to the end of the talk. But what I want to do is try and be fair and comment on the whole presentation. And to begin, I have to really say, and many people who know me here will be surprised to hear me say this, I have absolutely no argument with the economic analysis that Professor Glaeser is presenting. I, too, agree that cities are essential to the economic well-being of a nation-state, or as he puts it, the gifts of urban density can't be duplicated in suburban or rural areas. And I would go on and even add to say that you actually can't have a great nation without great cities. So we really agree and begin with the same premise that, cities have been especially important both to the economic well-being and to the progress of civilized world. And I think that the argument that Professor Glaeser makes about that cities originally developed for essentially economic reasons is convincing and correct. I think historically there's no question that people move into cities, into areas of great density for economic opportunity, and that one of the essential reasons for cities to exist has to be economic, and if cities have no economic base, it calls into question of why they exist at all. So what I want to do is continue here with Professor Glaeser's story and to suggest to everyone, including Professor Glaeser, that there's a missing significant explanatory variable in this story, and that the missing variable is really the role of activist government, both nationally as well as at the city level. So probably where we diverge in terms of our explanations, although there are a lot of little tidbits in this talk that imply that government is an actor in this history, but it's not really articulated in that way. So I'm not sure that we disagree completely about the progression, but maybe about the explanation, about why all of this has happened the way it's happened historically. So that if we look at this question of the role of activist government in the context of the value of cities or of urban success stories, and we go back to the original question of the talk, why is New York America's largest city, or maybe we might say its greatest city, as I would suggest, we have to ask another question, another series of questions, which is why did some of the other so-called great cities in the United States decline and not revitalize the way New York had? Because it is a cycle, and I would suggest to you the cycles of decline in the 20th century are much deeper than the talk suggested, and probably that may be due to the time constraints. And why did they grow to begin with? And why are people in businesses still locating in New York City and not in Detroit or not even in a place like Philadelphia? So we have a sort of series in my mind of unanswered questions which relate to the role of government. So let me quickly go through some historical points here and then, cut to the chase to the 21st century. Even at the most early stages of city formation, I think one would have to add to the story that, yes, New York had the port, and it had these geographic advantages in the trade economy. But, you can have a geographic advantage that you take advantage of or that you run into the ground. And what you had in this period was government investing in the infrastructure of the port, whether it was wharves at the city level or the state, later on investing in the Erie Canal, and we could go into more examples of that. You don't have a vibrant port in New York, a growing port, simply because you have an investment by government in the economy, particularly at the local and state level. And one could make similar arguments for each period of time that Professor Glaeser discusses. And if we go into the period post-1898 in consolidation and the expansion of New York City government, or even if we take the period before, New York was especially effective in early city creation and doing the things that businesses needed government to do. First and foremost was maintaining the safety and security of the business community. And when we look at the first government function that New York City government had, it was public safety. But it wasn't really public safety. It wasn't making sure that poor people weren't killed by other poor people. It was protecting property rights, and it was protecting the property of the business class. So it facilitated the kind of economic development that happened in this early period. Again, that's a much longer conversation. But the expansiveness of New York City government, I would argue, was actually reflects a strength of New York City that carries over to today. And so later on, we'll see that we go into a period in the 1970s when it's argued that expansive local government was the cause of financial crisis. I would suggest to you probably the revitalization of New York and the failure of other cities to be able to do what New York did came from this cushion created in this period by an expansive government that invested in the economy. And how do I think they invested in the economy? Well, by creating an infrastructure and a set of basic services that actually worked. So New York had the most expansive set of basic city services of any city in the country. It wasn't just housekeeping services, as old Mayor Daley of Chicago liked to call them, which was police, fire, and sanitation. New York built, a series of tunnels to create a clean water system early on that, by the way, we're still using now. We have a third water tunnel that we hope to finish, but if it wasn't for the water tunnels that was built in these early periods, we would be in big trouble right now. New York also built a very comprehensive system of sewer and sanitation. We have a transportation infrastructure that no other city in the United States has for mass transit. And in the 1930s, when all of these mass transit systems were essentially would have gone bankrupt, they were originally created by the private sector, but they could not produce a profit. Government buys all of the subways and invests in them and creates the subway system that we know today. And I would suggest to you that New York invested extensively in its public education system so that when immigrants came, they had a ladder of upward mobility. So you might be able to find a job, in the manufacturing sector. But the City University of New York, everybody will tell you, whether they're a neocon or a lunatic liberal, they will tell you that CUNY was their avenue to success and mobility. New York also has and still has the most extensive public housing system in the country. And it invested in its public housing, and we could talk about the impacts of rent control. That's another conversation. But we have affordable housing in New York City. And, that would be probably another debate that we don't want to go into today. The point is, government invested in a series of services that I would argue supported the quality of life of people in New York and created a place where people wanted to live and businesses wanted to locate over the long term. So it wasn't just the natural advantages of the city, which I absolutely agree with, but we see in the late 20th century, as we move into the information economy, that the city's natural advantages don't carry it all the way to the finish line. And this is a period, I have 2 minutes, and this is a period of government disinvestment, okay? And a period in which you find, and there are no accidents is partly what I want to say. No economic accidents and no political accidents. We have suburbanization that occurs that really creates a huge problem for most central cities in this country. It doesn't happen just because the federal government has the Federal Highway Act and the GI Bill, which makes it cheaper to invest for businesses in the suburban areas. Read, Ken Jackson's book on Crabgrass Frontier. It's a great read, and it'll give you that whole process. And the details in there are very important. And I would suggest to you now that we don't get till, the 1970s is a devastating period for American cities, including New York. New York withstands it in an ironic way, but we don't get to the post-1970s turnaround until city government starts to reassert itself again. Ed Koch, okay, folks? It's not till Ed Koch comes in, and basically the really important thing that he did is he forced reinvestment in mass transit. He is the one who went up to the state and forced the state to start reinvesting again in New York City mass transit, which is literally falling apart. You've seen all those movies. I don't have to tell you about that. The progression continues with Dinkins and Giuliani on the crime prevention front. I love it that Giuliani takes all this credit for crime prevention. The reality is that David Dinkins went to Albany to get Safe Streets, Safe Cities passed, 3,000 more cops with a targeted tax to support that. But the great story is that the mayor who said government can't work used city police department. They are public servants and they are members of government. They're the ones who did this big turnaround and made the city a place again that was viable for business investment. Business doesn't just leave or just come in. Cities have to require activist governments. And mayors for a very long time, and I have a theory on this, abdicated too in a period in which the federal government disinvests. And they basically begin in the 1980s to reclaim their cities. And it's not just in New York, it's in Minneapolis, and it's in San Francisco, and I'm not talking about the Sun Belt now, but the Sun Belt's had to do the same thing. It had its own period of decline, but not as dramatic. And so, the end of the story is Michael Bloomberg, and what he's done, and what could have happened in 9/11, post 9/11, we lost 240,000 jobs in New York. And while the statistics on the financial service sector are accurate, what we're seeing is an increasing diversification of the city's economy, for better or for worse, in the health sector, in the tourism sector, and also, of course, investing in the other areas that require not the knowledge economy. But the reality is nobody wanted to live here, and businesses didn't want to come here until we could reclaim a quality of life that really attracted this kind of investment. And so I would just conclude by saying that cities aren't really viable unless you have a robust economy. And I agree with Professor Glaeser on everything he said in that score. But I would also suggest that there are natural advantages that some cities have, but economic growth doesn't really happen by accident, and that it's ultimately government's capacity to support the work of its great cities. Because in the end, government can also destroy their great cities by not supporting them. New Yorkers have understood this, I think, better than most other cities around the country, and they've supported activist government. And I would suggest to you that it's not just economics, but it's politics. Thank you.
I want to first say I'm very honored to comment on Ed's work. I think, as a colleague and sort of in Ed's cohort, I will say that, I think there's little doubt that Ed's thinking about cities has really been sort of the first serious work, and maybe sort of the ideas that Ed's worked on still is really, from economist perspective, probably the only really meritable work in probably at least the last 30 years since we really started thinking about cities and race, which was kind of the last heyday of urban. And I think the ideas that Ed thinks about are really still the ideas that other people are working off of in their sort of thinking. I'm going to really focus on the back half of what Ed talked about. I'm not an expert in Italian Renaissance art, although I did take class when I was in college on said subject. I think I got less out of it than Ed did in that process. But I really want to combine several of the ideas that he's talked about into, I think, raising some questions, but are more or less off of the same ideas, which are things like supply constraints, how we think about human capital in cities, and in particular, and sort of commenting on both Ed and Esther's comments, sort of the question which economists would call causality, which is what causes what when we sort of look at this. And I, definitely would sort of ask the question.
Political scientists call it causality too. Don't worry.
Historians look at this a little differently, but I think the question of causality is really important here. I would put it in the context of, could anybody have been mayor of New York while Giuliani was and presided over the same decline in crime? And there's, a fair bit of evidence on research into crime that suggests that New York was predisposed because of the people who are here to see that decline in crime. And the question is, similarly, would the same thing have been true of Koch and Bloomberg? I happen to like Bloomberg a lot as a mayor, but I wouldn't point to the decline in crime necessarily as being sort of the reason I think he's been a good mayor. So the sort of first, the first thing is just sort of, I think the idea that Ed sort of talked about a long time ago, which is consumer cities and consumption, is really kind of the big change of what we've seen kind of before and after World War II, as the economy, particularly the U.S. economy, moved away from manufacturing and towards a skills-based economy. The value of consumption, the value of who you're around are really important. I think it's very hard to disentangle the effect of consumption externalities from production externalities. When I think about the great things about New York, I certainly think about subways, but let me comment that Rochester, New York, I hate to say, has a defunct subway system. So if it were just sort of the construction of subways, Rochester, New York was in fact, a great city in the 1840s and 1850s when my step-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather co-founded Western Union. And by the way, the money left. The money stopped 2 generations ago. The 3rd generation ago was when they actually were buying trains to go back and forth to Maine. They'd buy the whole train because they wanted to go. So the money long ago left. But Rochester, New York was a great city. It had what at the time was a great university at the University of Rochester. And it had a lot of things, but somehow Rochester, New York hasn't transcended into modern times. And I think it's not just about kind of infrastructure. And I also don't think if Ed Koch were mayor in Rochester, that Rochester would be in much better shape than it is now, nor in fact Michael Bloomberg, because I think it has a lot to do with the underlying characteristics that people had to work with in Rochester. I think technology has great benefits for consumption. And has great benefits for things. I just think about having, gotten together with friends when, I played volleyball in New York. And we send one email out, and all of a sudden people know to meet at a bar at this time, and it took 2 minutes to do it. And so technology also makes consumption very valuable. The ability to find new and interesting and different restaurants, clearly sort of Zagat's and, the technology associated with that, time out, finding clubs, interesting stuff, those have made New York a much better place to consume. And one might argue that technology has increased returns on the consumption side at least as much as it has on the production side of what's going on. And in fact, the fact that people email their neighbor or, send telephone calls for work-related stuff isn't so clear to me that that's production enhancing the way it does with consumption. So I think technology has benefited consumption in a very significant way. I think the big causality question I have on Ed's work is really the issue of agglomeration of skills versus skills people deciding to locate in places which are supply constrained for reasons that may have to do with agglomeration of sort of production, that is the exchange of ideas, but may also have to do with limited supply and preferences. So I have a paper with the longtime co-author of Ed's, Joe Jerko, and Todd Sinai, in which we sort of write down a relatively simple model in which you can get the same kinds of predictions. If you just have a world of 2 cities that are otherwise identical, one of them allows growth and the other doesn't. So one of the other facts, and again, these are all interpretations of facts that Ed has brought to the table through his entire body of work. If one thinks about sort of Houston and San Francisco, what's happened in Houston, I would argue that Houston and San Francisco have been probably the 2 biggest post-war success stories. San Francisco has seen almost no population growth. Houston has seen enormous population growth. If you ask most people in this room, where would you like to live, I think most people in this room would say they'd like to live in San Francisco. I just know that San Francisco and Houston are both enormously popular places to live. It's just in Houston there's no zoning. And in San Francisco, the entire city has gained, the metropolitan area has gained 600,000 people since World War II, where over the similar period of time, Houston has added millions. I don't think the zoning that Ed has pointed to is unrelated to that. And if all you have in the world is a bunch of people who want to live in Houston and another bunch who live in San Francisco, and San Francisco doesn't get any bigger, and Houston can grow as big as it wants, you can end up with a world where in San Francisco, the only people who can afford to live there are basically people who earn enough money to outbid the other people who want to live there. Whereas in Houston, anybody can live in Houston, and in such a model what happens is the human capital in Houston kind of moves below average more and more and more, whereas in San Francisco the human capital goes up. It has nothing to do with agglomeration of production, but it does have to do with the fact that, as you know, sort of to paraphrase Yogi Berra, they're the only people who can afford to live there. But that is, in a world where something is in fixed supply and it's desired by a variety of people, it's going to go to people who make the most money. And so one can look at the national income distribution and tie shifts out in the national income distribution to shifts in the relative income distribution of high-wage versus low-wage cities. Now, a big question that Ed would naturally ask, which is to put up his third slide, which is showing the same pattern in the world as it is in the United States, and then ask, well, are there global superstar cities? I think if one looks at cities like Hong Kong and Paris and London, other cities where we've seen enormous price increases, but not as much new building, I think there really is a link between the supply side and one that we have to think about. The big puzzle that I know we've talked about and other people have talked about, well, why is it that in the South, for example, people let you build whatever you like, but in the Northeast and California they don't? And it's hard to think about a model that generates that result, in part because, I think it's in local interest to never let people build. Because if the median voter is a homeowner, new construction reduces house prices, therefore the median voter should never let anybody build houses. So to my way of thinking as an economist, I don't understand why anybody doesn't have zoning. And so,
I'll explain it to you.
Well, I think I'd love to believe the world where people are sort of, nice thinking sort of folks, but, the same group of people that are, often big donors to general left causes are also people who are out there in their neighborhood not wanting things to get built. So I don't think it's...
So it's not about the median voter, is it?
But then you got to tell me why that same power and money hasn't worked in the South. Because I think it's in everybody's interest to do it.
It's called political culture, why it doesn't work in the South. It's got...
If they're having a debate, then I want in on this.
Right. So let me...
Very good.
So
God responded.
All right.
Okay,
Yeah, so,
I'll wait my turn, even though it's against my political culture.
Then we'll have maybe a question from the floor, and then we can move back to our panel.
No, Ed has to speak.
Yeah.
First, and then the question will be back.
Chris gets to finish up, right?
Chris gets finished up.
Okay. I will say on political culture, one comment, which is, by my way of thinking, and probably Ed's to some extent, it's endogenous, which is political culture grows out of the sort of conditions that are there that are in particular places. So the other there are other comments on Ed's work. I think clearly infrastructure matters. I think about the infrastructure in New York that's enormously important is not just the subway system, but the museums, the opera, the symphonies, a lot of things which I think New York is simply the preeminent place in the country, maybe with the exception of Chicago, that comes anywhere near the kinds of institutions that New York has. Those are mostly privately provided institutions, and they've provided an enormous amount of capital for New York. So
That's actually not right, by the way. Government supports cultural institutions in New York with huge amounts of money.
Am I allowed to comment?
That's not right.
So this is not a comment that government doesn't support institutions, but it is a comment that without the great
I agree. I agree.
without the great entrepreneurs in New York, we wouldn't have those institutions.
Of course.
And that has been a big part of the capital that has made New York great. So one thing, Ed, that I may have heard you say is you thought New York wasn't a consumer city.
No. I said it wasn't. I wasn't making the claim that New York was the leading consumer city in the country.
Right.
But it certainly is a huge consumer city.
But I think for high-income people, New York is, in fact, not only the leading consumer city in the country, but maybe one of the 2 or 3 leading consumer cities in the world, and that's been an enormous benefit of New York. So I'll stop there. Again, I think Ed's comments are enormously insightful and interesting, and I think there's a lot of really valuable insights in what he's talked about.
Okay, great. So I'll let Ed, if you want to ask a question, maybe just line up behind the podium, the microphone, and we'll let you get it after Ed's given his little bit, okay?
I'm going to be a little bit, so you might. Let me just thank both commentators for really terrific and provocative comments. I agree with a great deal of what they both said. Quickly to respond to Chris, I believe in the superstar city story. I believe in the endogeneity of the skill levels of group. You shouldn't, though, get confused by that on thinking that this is all just sort of ex post human capital, right? As I said in the talk, if you use, say, share the population with college degrees in 1940. You would see almost exactly the same graphs that you see today, long before any of the growth restrictions that we now see came into operation. Which does not mean that those growth restrictions aren't incredibly important mediating influences. But you shouldn't think that this is all sort of a spurious correlation that these places are, become successful and then attracted skilled people. I also particularly agree with Chris on the notion that electronic technology has also been a better of consumption-related city events. And I just want to get out an idea here, which is, I think, important. In some sense, the big question about what electronic interactions do for cities is the question of whether or not electronic interactions and face-to-face interactions are complements or substitutes. Will the face-to-face interactions that are the heart of cities actually become more valuable as electronic interactions get easier? And I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they are at least as much likely to be complements as they are substitutes in lots of different ways. Let me now move to the point about government and thinking about this. Despite the fact that there's, Bentley didn't mention it, but I am a Chicago PhD, and it is certainly true that I have certain innate laissez-faire leanings. But it is impossible. It is impossible to look at the history of cities and think that there isn't an important and significant role for activist government, starting, of course, with protection of property rights and even more importantly, clean water. Right? The fact that you're not dying of cholera all the time is something that you have to thank city governments for. It is absolutely also true that the Erie Canal was an important and successful government intervention. The private competitors couldn't do it. Right? The Potomac Company that tried to do the same thing, it didn't do it. And to this day, it is important, in fact, to have an activist city government because screwing up in these areas can be enormously harmful. Let me, however, though, take issue with the view that if you're going to try to explain why some cities are more or less successful, say, over the last 30 years, what you see is a steady pattern that more activist city governments and more investment have made cities do better. I know of no empirical evidence looking across cities to suggest that fact. In fact, all the facts that I've seen on these, looking across cities and looking at extra spending, suggest exactly the contrary. So just to emphasize on this, it is not that I am against activist government. For goodness sakes, Professor Fuchs is dead right that we need activist governments. But the view that New York was saved by having huge amounts of government investment, and if only they had more, we'd be doing better, that's certainly far from obvious to me. And just to end on I was the one thing that I did take grave issue to as a big Ed Koch fan is citing the declining crime with Dinkins. Rather than with Koch, which is where as you well know, the turnaround. But you were connecting it with Dinkins rather than with Koch, where the declining crime, which is appropriate for your point.
No, the declining crime doesn't start till David Dinkins becomes.
No, it's wrong. It starts in the mid 1970s. It's a fact.
No, it's actually. I'm sorry. My office is next to David Dinkins.
What happens is it starts declining from 1975 to say 1988, and it peaks up during crack, and then it goes down again. That's the sort of pattern.
Everybody in the city of New York associates the decline in crime in the last year of the Dinkins administration is the beginning of the decline that continues from that point all the way through the Bloomberg administration. I mean, that's the data that everybody
You
uses.
just look at murders.
I think what he's talking about, there's a crack.
There's a crack that the general thing. This is Levitt's big point on this, right? There's a general, which is I think not debated in the crime literature. There's a huge decline in crime. It's actually nationwide. It's not particular to New York. It starts in huge boom 60 to 75, huge decline 75 to 88, crack-related boom up in murders 88 to 91.
Oh,
decline from 91
I'm sorry.
To,
I was talking
decline from 91 onward.
I'm talking from post-1975. I start with
Right,
the
there's
fiscal.
a huge decline 75 to 88, then a huge peak up
There's
88.
a huge decline from 75 to 88 in
Yep.
New York City?
There's a decline in crime from New York City from 75 to 88.
No, I'm sorry. I can go back to my office and get you this
We
data.
should talk about something else.
It's not accurate. It's just not accurate.
Do you have a question?
I do.
I'm scooting.
75 to.
I don't know.
There's a huge
Just-
increase.
Look, all right. It may be true that it may be possible that I've confused national trends with New
Yeah,
York.
that
trends.
maybe
That
it's
is- that is
national. It's
conceivable.
not the large cities.
Could you
It's not
two
New
do
York.
this afterwards? Or? If I may just introduce myself with a small comment. My name is Alice Labrie. I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service. I'm a resident of what's left of Harlem on the Harlem River, courtesy of my government, which has given us a Mitchell-Lama development. So my question is, do you see a reverse trend of people leaving the city to retire? Because I'm not going anywhere. I've had friends who've retired, blah, blah, and I can't wait to get back. So it feels like this generation may not be, retiring from the city. I was just curious about that.
There have been papers written on this. I think that, in fact, the surprising fact is I would almost think that cities would be particularly attractive places for people to retire because people need less space and cities have lots of fun things going on. I think you see no current trend suggesting that people are retiring, leaving urban areas, but not as much of a trend as I would expect. In fact, going the opposite direction of people moving back from suburbs. Now, there's some of that, but it's not when you look at the data, it's relatively flat by the demographic groups. At least that's the most recent study that I looked at on this.
The rent control issue, though, makes New York a particularly tough example to know. But for rent controlled or rent stabilized or Mitchell-Lama units, would people actually leave if they were forced to pay the market rent? But people who have been living there a very long time are getting a very, very low rent relative to current, and that's hard for New York City in particular. It's very hard to disentangle.
Fascinating topic. Thank you for coming here. You talked about the growth of the shipping industry in New York. That led, in some ways, to the growth of the sugar refining industry. I'm sure the growth of the sugar refining industry would lead to the growth of a third industry and a fourth, and et cetera. And from that, we can deduce perhaps that bigness begets further bigness. And I'm wondering, is there a limit to what is it from a macroeconomic perspective that would limit the growth of the city?
I think that there are, just as there are agglomeration economies that make things more productive when they're clustered together and cause ideas to flow, there are also clearly, various congestion economies, if you want to call them, right? I mean, it both becomes more expensive to build up. Even without zoning, housing in New York would cost more because it's more expensive to build, tall skyscrapers rather than, row after row of single-family tract housing. The same proximity that makes it easy to, get the hogshead onto the ship or get an idea from one person to another also makes it easy to steal, right? Crime has long been highly correlated with urban density, and that comes from the same sort of innate feature of cities. Naturally you get congestion of other various public goods. So I think these two things are competing against each other, and those congestion economies tend to set in after a while. But I think that the interesting thing in some sense is how weak they are over broad ranges of city growth. And I think it's very hard for me to believe that, say, if New York were going to add a population of 20 or 30%, I don't think that would if handled properly with appropriately an activist government to manage it. I don't think that would be in any sense something that would destroy the character of this city's life.
Can I ask Ed, I want to ask Ed a question, actually. And I, of course, I think the talk it's immensely important, the research you've done, and I think has made a terrific and important contribution to the whole academic as well as policy discussion of the role, the role of cities in the 21st century America as well as the world. So I want to make that clear. I'm wondering what you think about this question of whether or not a city has to continue to grow or it declines. And I think it comes off of one of the points you made about, the differences between a San Francisco and Houston, because in fact, it's true, New York has zoning laws, and zoning did restrict artificially the growth, and in the last 6 years, the Bloomberg administration has done more rezoning than the last 50 years. We were the last city in the country to have our waterfront reclaimed. So zoning, can be an impediment to growth. I think that's true, but it also can be used, I believe, in a very constructive way. For instance, what we've been doing in zoning is zone for density in areas where there's a lot of mass transit. So we're trying to deal with the environmental sustainability issue in a reasonable way, and then actually down zone in a couple of neighborhoods in Queens and Staten Island to protect the character of those communities. And in fact, those are areas which are least accessible to mass transit, so there's multiple reasons to do that. So I'm wondering, like the San Francisco example, if San Francisco could grow, would it be San Francisco anymore, and would people then still want to live there? I mean, isn't there some value in that? And I know Mayor Bloomberg's been very adamant about the city's going to grow by 1 million people and we've got to deal with it, and that growth is essential. Population growth is actually essential to economic growth. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I as usual, on everything else other than cigarettes, I agree with the mayor. And it's not even. I'm not even saying actually that's bad public policy. That's just my libertarian side speaking. It may well have been good public policy. It's a very difficult thing, right? Balancing land use restrictions and the desire to preserve, beautiful older communities. It's not as if there isn't actually a role for landmarks preservation in this world. This challenge is actually even bigger in European cities than it is in New York, which are jewels of human civilization that we don't want to destroy by running roughshod over them. But on some basic level, I think that Jane Jacobs was wrong on this. I think that if you love cities, and if you think that cities should be a major part in human civilization, then you've got to think that more people should be able to enjoy them. You've got to think that it's better if cities are not priced out to all but the most affluent hedge fund managers. And while public affordable housing can help that, I mean the real engine of affordable housing is private production. And that's not going to happen unless things are restricted. I think that actually the mayor has been very smart about this. I think that you're exactly right. That actually trying to figure out places where you're not running roughshod over beautiful old communities, but you're still putting in density in places where you have access to public transportation or even access to to walking areas that are great. I think that's great, and I think thinking about how European cities can do that is exactly right. I would still push him to be more aggressive on some of the areas where I don't think that the old Sotheby's building on Madison Avenue needed to be down zone, but I still am going to push on the other direction. But no, I think the mayor has been very smart on that. And I think this is also, if you do believe in climate change, right? I mean, this is the strange paradox of California environmentalism, right? That in some sense, the same environmental rhetoric that's been used to actually create cleaner appliances and cleaner electricity is also used to shut down new production in the most environmentally green place in the country, right? So and California communities don't have the ability to stop development in this country. They can just flick a switch off so it doesn't occur in San Francisco, and that just turns it on in Houston. Right? So the same sort of, the two sides of environmentalism work in completely opposite directions. The part that shuts down development in California ensures that will go on in some of the brownest areas of the country that actually don't have any rules about new production, whereas the other side is working to restrict stuff. So again, if you think environmentalism is important, then you should be out there protesting against the landmark guys cutting down tall buildings.
Okay, well, can I make one
I guess as since we're all New Yorkers here, it's impossible to get a word in edgewise. So, Chris, go ahead.
So just one other observation, which is sort of the idea of creative destruction, which we think about in other sort of contexts. I think one has to have in cities, which follows along sort of some of Ed's comments, which is look, there were farms in the Bronx at one point. There were, all sorts of things. If we take the arguments of people who live in edge suburbs that there are farms here, we've got to keep them, and the world ultimately changes. And the population is going to continue growing, and we have to put it somewhere. And I think the idea of providing, dealing with the congestion externality, which is clearly the most important thing, makes a lot of sense, which is, why the Bloomberg administration, what they're doing, makes a lot of sense. But I still think we've way erred on the side of too much preservation. And I think when we ask sort of who are the people who bear the brunt of this, it's all poor people who are priced out because they can't take advantage of living in other places. And I think, if we're really going to, if we want to really support the poor, the best place for somebody to really be able to afford to own a home is in places where there's no zoning. And that's not an accident. It is really an anti-poor policy to really restrict fundamentally new construction.
Okay, well, I think I would like to thank everybody for participating. As you can see, so I guess the final word is, we're this evening.
I'm sorry. Could we still have one?
Well, I think we're overtime. At 7:30 was actually our overtime. So I think we should just you can come and speak to. You come ask them a question right now. But I think what we'll do is we'll stop since we like to be on time. But I also like to say that this is a very healthy debate. You can see the sort of work we're doing here at SIPA to sort of investigate these issues, and there's no end of questions, and I'm sure there'll be no end of discussion between our three participants regarding the future of New York. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to thank our participants once again. Thank you.